Egypt, April 47 BC. Julius Caesar leaves Cleopatra for Anatolia on the hunt for Pharnaces II of Pontus, king of the Bosphorus kingdom. He arrives with one thing on his mind: to wreak revenge for the atrocities Pharnaces has committed against Caesar's countrymen. The two armies meet at Zela in modern-day Turkey. The Pontic army attacks the Romans, who they outnumber by 2-1, but as they crash against Caesar's defensive line, like waves on rocks, they are slaughtered and defeated, leading Caesar after the battle, in a letter to the Roman Senate, to write one of the most famous phrases in human history: Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Many thanks to our sponsor, Rise of Kingdoms, an epic mobile-based RTS game with unrivaled degrees of freedom. Choose from 11 historical civilizations, with commanders such as Gaius Marius, Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar himself, along with their own unique units to conquer rival kingdoms. Explore a zoomable, seamless world map and expand your domain by building up your cities and forces, progressing from a clan to a kingdom, and ultimately, an empire. Simply click the link in the video description and enter the special promo code before the 31st of April and start your campaign with a free bonus bundle of a silver key, gems, wood, and food. On the 23rd of August 55 BC, after boarding 2 legions onto a flotilla made up of 80 transport ships as well as various warships, Julius Caesar and his legions set sail from Portus Itius, present-day Boulogne, whilst another 18 transports of cavalry set out from Ambleteuse, also in the Pas-de-Calais region of France, and their combined forces crossed the English Channel, heading for Britain. Assessing their options at the natural port of Dover, Caesar quickly realised their landing point was within javelin reach of the hordes of Britons waiting on the White Cliffs. He set sail again, further down the coast this time, and landed off Deal, between Walmer and Pegwell Bay on the coast of Kent. Prior to this first incursion into British territory, Caesar had received ambassadors from Britain whilst in Gaul, promising their submission to his upcoming invasion, which they had heard news of from merchants. He sent them back to Britain, along with Commius, king of the Atrebates, to win over the other British tribes, and so ease the way for his planned invasion. Commius had been made king of the Gallic Atrebates by Caesar, following their subjugation and defeat along with the Nervii at the Battle of Sabis. The Atrebates at the time occupied territory in both Belgium and Britain, but on his arrival in Britain, Commius was taken captive. During Caesar's negotiations, following his arrival in Britain in 55 BC, Commius was returned to Caesar, along with other hostages, by the leaders of various tribes, who blamed the skirmishes following attacks on Caesar's foraging parties on local bands of commoners, but Commius was able to recruit cavalry from local allied tribes to aid Caesar in defending his position. The ships bearing Caesar's cavalry reinforcements were unable to land on the Kent coast due to storms and rough sea conditions, and many of Caesar's own ships were also wrecked and damaged at this time due to the unexpected ferocity of the seas, and so with food running short and British tribes continuing their attacks on the Roman encampment, Caesar decided it was time to return to Gaul before the onset of winter. Caesar was successful in securing a foothold in Britain, and the ensuing negotiations gained him some alliances with the British tribes. However, on the island, many others were still hostile to the Romans, and so Caesar would soon return to the continent, unwilling to spend the winter on the mysterious island, intending to return again at a later date. Only a year after his first invasion of England, Caesar again attempted another more elaborate incursion on the island. This time he went unchallenged on his arrival at Kent, as the Celts were alarmed by his larger fleet arriving on the southeast coast, and this second attempt at subjugating the region would be more successful, with Caesar defeating a Celtic alliance led by Cassivellaunus of the Catavallani tribe north of the Thames. Caesar later entered into an agreement with the leader of the Trinovantes, Mandubratius, to create a client kingdom of his lands, but the other tribes surrendered, such as the Senimagni and Segontiarchi, who later revealed the whereabouts of Cassivellaunus bringing his stand against the Romans to a halt and forcing him to pay tribute to the Republic. Once more, unwilling to spend winter in Britain, Caesar returned to Gaul, where an uprising over poor grain harvests had threatened Roman rule, but the threat failed to materialize, and after this time, Caesar would never again return to Britain. Meanwhile, Marcus Licinius Crassus was engaged in conflicts in Parthia, and Pompey was in Rome, and the third member of the first triumvirate, Caesar, remained in Gaul until his term as governor was at an end. However, in 53 BC, following a decisive loss at the Battle of Carrhae in a conflict against the Parthian Empire, the leader of the Roman forces, Marcus Licinius Crassus, was killed. It could be said that it was Crassus who had held the triumvirate together, as his political connections and great wealth balanced the political aspirations of the other two members, and his influence acted as a check on them, and so it was that on his death, the first triumvirate ended. Even before Crassus's death, the ties between Caesar and Pompey had begun to fray with the death of Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, Julia, in 54 BC, when she died giving birth, which according to Seneca, Caesar heard the news of whilst in Britain, and soon afterwards, Caesar offered Pompey the hand of his great niece in marriage to maintain the political alliance between the two, but Pompey declined. Thus, with the death of Julia, the familial alliance between Pompey and Caesar was ended, which would have been good news for the Optimates, and especially Marcus Tullius Cicero and Cato the Younger, who opposed Caesar and his party, the Populares, at every step. And so it was then that Pompey changed his allegiance and sided with the representatives of Rome's aristocrats, the Optimates, and instead came to oppose Caesar. What followed was unrest and discord in Rome, and an eventual power struggle between the remaining members of the triumvirate, Pompey and Caesar. The situation, along with the lack of Crassus's restraining influence on the two men, would eventually result in civil war in Rome. In 52 BC, Pompey married Cornelia, a daughter of one of Caesar's political opponents, Quintus Caecilius Metellus Scipio. She was far younger than Pompey, and the marriage was seen by the people as a distraction from the crisis going on in Rome at the time, and as such inappropriate. In addition, his unpopularity was growing because he was seen as biased in his pronouncements over trials. Meanwhile, in 52 BC, whilst Rome was in turmoil, Caesar had been forced to remain in Gaul as a rebellion had broken out amongst the Gallic tribes against the Roman invaders. This was led, amongst others, by Vercingetorix, a noble and later king of the Arverni tribe, who had risen up against the nobles of his own tribe, who adopted a policy of avoidance of Caesar and his forces. Vercingetorix had initially rallied support to fight the Romans, but was expelled from Gergovia, so he raised an army, returned to Gergovia, expelled his opponents, and was declared king of the Arverni, forming allegiances with many of the other Gallic tribes, and leading the Gallic offensive against the Romans. To counter this insurrection, Caesar was aided by Rome's allies, the Aedui people, at the Battle of Gergovia, and although Caesar had persuaded the Aedui leaders to join him, they were tempted by Arverni emissaries with promises of wealth, resulting in them turning on the Roman forces and attacking their supply chain. Caesar then surrounded and defeated the Aedui rebels, and regaining their loyalty, they joined him in the offensive, but Vercingetorix took advantage of this Roman Aedui confusion and ordered a cavalry charge, which inflicted huge losses on the Roman force, and following this defeat, Caesar was forced to retreat northeastwards, in the direction of Aedui territory, marking Caesar's first defeat of the Gallic Wars. Vercingetorix was declared king of the Arverni following his victory at the Battle of Gergovia. He was a harsh leader who imposed strict discipline on his troops and took hostages. He adopted a scorched earth policy, whereby he would burn strongholds of his countrymen to stop the Romans replenishing their supplies. And after the Battle of Gergovia, he burned the lands on his march north to meet Caesar once again. Later in 52 BC, Vercingetorix was persuaded to spare the capital of the Bituriges at Avaricum from burning, as the inhabitants protested that the town, one of the largest Gallic cities in the region, had strong defences and an easily defended position, so he camped outside the town's limits instead, before moving on. However, when the Romans did arrive and lay siege to Avaricum, the fortress fell and the Romans captured the capital. During the capture of Avaricum, the Romans overpowered their defences and massacred almost 40,000 men, following a long standoff against the Gauls, who fought to the death, unwilling to give up their homelands. And following this, Caesar fed and rested his men at Avaricum until early June, when he marched north and met Vercingetorix again at the Battle of Alesia in eastern Gaul, where the Gallic king and his army were besieged by Caesar, marking the last significant confrontation of Vercingetorix's uprising. Alesia was a fortified settlement on a high hill with rivers to two sides, and so, as its defences were so strong, Caesar decided to form a blockade around the settlement and besiege it over several days, starving the 80,000-strong army, along with the civilians who lived there. To do this, his forces built 10 miles of fortifications with 24 redoubts, or towers, around Alesia, consisting of a rampart with 11-foot-high palisades. Behind this were battlements with openings for shooting through, and wooden breast-height screens with stakes to prevent scaling. Growing increasingly desperate, Vercingetorix sent for relief forces from neighbouring tribes, and when Caesar heard of this, he ordered the construction of an outer ring of fortifications and the digging of 3 trenches, one far from the defences, which was manned to alert of nighttime or surprise attacks, one inner trench, a trap disguised with twigs and branches, and the one closest to the fortifications was filled with water from the river. But before long, with food running short, the old and sick of the town were forced to leave the settlement, and Caesar refused to give them sanctuary, sealing their doom. Then, when the Gallic reinforcements under Vercassivellaunus, a cousin of Vercingetorix, arrived, they launched an attack from outside on the Roman fortifications, and simultaneously, the Gauls within Alesia mounted their own assault on the fortifications within, concentrating on one particular point, but to no avail, as Caesar's trusted lieutenant Mark Antony successfully reinforced their hard-pressed legions with troops from across the neighbouring Roman garrisons and held off the attack. After this, the Gauls assaulted the Roman defences in one last-ditched attempt to break the invaders' resistance, and just when the Gallic reinforcements began to infiltrate the walls surrounding Alesia, Caesar led a cavalry contingent beyond the defences and attacked the Gauls from behind, sparking a rout, meaning that before long, all the reinforcements under Vercassivellaunus were in headlong retreat, and so Julius Caesar had won one of the most famous battles in the history of Rome, and indeed, the world. The next day, Vercingetorix held a meeting of his kinsmen and suggested he should either be killed or handed over to the Romans to request clemency and save his remaining people. After which, Caesar ordered the Gauls to put down their weapons and deliver their chieftains to him. Thus, Vercingetorix was surrendered to Caesar, and the captives the Romans had taken were given to the legionaries as slaves. The winning of the Siege of Alesia was the final battle of Caesar's Gallic Wars and marked the end of organised resistance against the Romans. It also marked the end of Rome's first fully fledged subjugation of the Gallic tribes, covering the northern regions of Europe, spanning current-day northern Italy, France, Belgium, and including parts of Germany. Vercingetorix was held captive by Caesar for 5 years. However, in 46 BC, as part of the celebrations for Caesar's triumph, he was dragged through the streets of Rome and then executed by strangulation, and to this day, he is considered a folk hero by the people of his native region in modern-day Auvergne, and indeed France as a whole. Although some versions of history suggest that the tribes of Europe were nothing but savages, they were in fact well organised, powerful, and wealthy, making Caesar's successes across Europe all the more remarkable, as Rome's territories were effectively doubled in size with the subjugation of Gaul, as historians estimate that up to 2 million people were killed and enslaved during his conquest of modern-day France, that has, over the centuries, become the stuff of legend. And with the victory at Alesia, the Gallic Wars were now all but over, and Caesar's thoughts turned to Rome. Although Caesar's victories had earned him great renown, his increasing power and military prowess made Rome's senators extremely nervous, which prompted them in 50 BC to demand that Caesar disband his forces and return to the Eternal City to be relieved of his command, as his governorship was at an end. But Caesar's supporters argued for an extension to his command in Gaul to consolidate his victories. Unsurprisingly, Cato argued against this, as he felt Caesar was becoming too powerful with the money and prestige he was gaining with his military successes. On the other hand, Pompey initially supported Caesar and backed him standing for the post of consul in absentia, or while still in Gaul, But Cato insisted he must return as a private citizen to stand for office. But Caesar would not give up his command, as he feared the move was a ruse to have him arrested as soon as he relinquished his military immunity. Subsequently, Pompey accused Caesar of treason and failing to follow orders. Once his conquest of Gaul was complete, Caesar chose to return to Rome, and feeling he had been backed into a corner, he had no other option but to enter into conflict with his opponents. He famously crossed the Rubicon River in northern Italy and invaded his own country on the 10th of January 49 BC, marking the beginning of the Civil War. In crossing the Rubicon, Caesar had legally committed treason, as he had refused to return to Rome without his army as the Senate had requested, which ultimately brought civil war to Rome. And on crossing the river, Suetonius records that Caesar quoted the Athenian playwright Menander in Greek, stating, "Alia iacta esto," or "let the die be cast," showing he knew there was now no going back. Ultimately, the resulting conflict, which is known as Caesar's Civil War, lasted for close to 3 years and included battles in Spain and France, with neither side managing to gain a conclusive victory, until finally Pompey conjured up a small triumph at the Battle of Dyrrhachium in Macedonia on the 10th of July 48 BC. But despite this, the Battle of Pharsalus shortly afterwards, on the 9th of August 48 BC, would prove to be the deciding confrontation of the war, and would secure both Julius Caesar and Pompey's names in the annals of history. In the lead-up to the confrontation, Caesar's forces were at a considerable disadvantage, as they were exhausted and had meagre provisions after the Battle of Dyrrhachium, their numbers totaling 22,000 legionaries in 80 cohorts, whereas Pompey's own forces were comprised of 40,000 men in 11 legions, or 88 cohorts, with auxiliary infantry and between 3,000 and 6,000 cavalry, who greatly outnumbered Caesar's own horsemen. After taking up a strong position, Pompey ordered his forces to wait for Caesar's army to approach, and so Caesar's front two lines of infantry, led by Mark Antony and Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus, started an advance, stopping to rest and regroup once within javelin throwing distance, before continuing and meeting Pompey's legions in a fierce and bloody melee. After this, Pompey's cavalry on his left flank was ordered to attack Caesar's own cavalry, who they greatly outnumbered, successfully pushing them back. But when they attempted to wheel around and behind Caesar's army, they were confronted by hidden legions, who used their javelins as spears to halt their foes, and were soon routed as a result. And so, with his enemy's left flank wide open, Caesar's hidden legions outflanked Pompey's army, whilst his battle-hardened veterans in his third line reinforced his centre, eventually causing Pompey's legions to break rank and flee the battlefield, granting Caesar both victory in the battle and the war. Pompey then fled to Egypt, where he was ultimately assassinated in September 48 BC, on the orders of the eunuch advisor of Ptolemy XIII, THEOS Philopator, of the Ptolemaic dynasty, 13-year-old brother of Queen Cleopatra, who had ruled with her jointly as husband and wife since 51 BC, before he deposed his sister queen and forced her to flee to Syria in the spring of 48 BC. Caesar followed Pompey to Egypt, leaving his general Mark Antony, who had served him faithfully, in control of Rome. However, by the time Caesar arrived in Egypt, Pompey had already been assassinated, and Caesar was presented with Pompey's head and seal ring, which Caesar received in tears, putting his assassins to death in an act of revenge. In killing Pompey, Ptolemy XIII appeared to act in Caesar's interest, but Caesar was not pleased, and though he had acted to reconcile Ptolemy with Queen Cleopatra, the terms Caesar proposed were seen as favouring the pharaoh's elder sister and enemy, and so the two royal siblings were soon engaged in open warfare, with Caesar forging a political alliance with Cleopatra, and while serving as co-commanders in Alexandria, Egypt in 48 BC, an intimate relationship between Caesar and the Egyptian queen began, as Ptolemy XIII laid siege to the city of Alexandria. Alexandria withstood Ptolemy's forces, who besieged the city for several months, through until the spring of 47 BC, when Caesar was relieved by Mithridates of Pergamum, culminating in the Battle of the Nile, where Ptolemy was defeated and drowned trying to cross the river. Following this victory, Cleopatra gave birth to Caesar's alleged son, Caesarion, who was formerly known in Egypt as Ptolemy XV Caesar, and she later ruled as co-regent with her surviving younger brother as Queen Cleopatra VII. Caesar and Cleopatra celebrated their victory by processing along the Nile in a barge accompanied by 400 other ships, and it was then that Cleopatra introduced Caesar to the luxurious privileges of the Egyptian royals. Their relationship continued, and Cleopatra visited Rome more than once, staying in Caesar's villa outside Rome. Caesar subsequently turned his attention to Armenia and the king of Pontus, Pharnaces II, son of Mithridates VI, as Pharnaces had taken the opportunity of Caesar's preoccupation with Egypt to occupy his father's old territory and expand his kingdom of the Bosphorus by invading Cappadocia, Bithynia, and Armenia Parva in 48 BC, where the king of Pontus had committed brutalities against the Romans. Pharnaces had defeated Caesar's legate, Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus, at the Battle of Nicopolis, and it was here that the atrocities against Roman prisoners and civilians occurred. And when the king of Pontus heard of Caesar's approach, he sent emissaries to sue for peace. However, Caesar refused, and angered by the atrocities, Caesar pursued Pharnaces and committed him to fight at the Battle of Zela in Turkey on the 2nd of August 47 BC, which resulted in a resounding victory for the Romans. Pharnaces escaped with his life and fled Caesar, but he was soon tracked down by Domitius and defeated once more when he lost Sinope to the Romans. He then fled to the Bosphorus and was killed in battle, and it was the rapid dispatch of Pharnaces within 5 days which led Caesar to comment in a letter he sent to Amantius in Rome, Veni Vidi Vici, which translates as the famous phrase, "I came, I saw, I conquered." And according to Suetonius, the same 3 words were displayed prominently at Caesar's triumph for the victory at Zela. Caesar then went on to Africa, where on the 4th of January 46 BC, he was defeated by Titus Labienus at Ruspina, but he later went on to gain victory over Cato's ally Quintus Caecilius Metellus Scipio at Thapsus, in modern-day Tunisia, who had been allied by King Juba I of Numidia, and in April 46 BC after the battle, Caesar would not accept the surrender of Scipio's troops, but had them all slaughtered instead, and on hearing of the defeat, Cato committed suicide in April 46 BC, rather than have to live in a world led by Caesar. After hearing of their father's death in Egypt, Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus Pompeius, joined their father's allies in Africa, but Gnaeus escaped after the Battle of Thapsus to the modern-day Balearic Islands, where he joined his brother Sextus and travelled to Hispania, modern-day Spain and Portugal, and raised an army with Titus Labienus, and on the 17th of March 45 BC, they met Caesar's forces at the Battle of Munda. As both sides had large forces and were well led, the opposing sides were well matched, but Caesar eventually prevailed, routing the Pompeian side and killing 30,000 of their troops. Titus Labienus was killed and granted the right of burial by Caesar, but Gnaeus and Sextus managed to escape, and within only a few weeks, Gnaeus, Pompey's eldest son, was killed at the Battle of Lauro, but Sextus managed to survive and outlived his brother by another 10 years. It was now evident that Caesar had won the civil war, and on his return to Rome in April 46 BC, he held an extravagant celebration of a quadruple triumph for his victories over foreign enemies such as Gaul and Egypt, as well as Pharnaces II in the Bosphorus and King Juba of Numidia. The Greek historian Appian of Alexandria records that although the war in Africa had been the last resistance of Cato and Scipio, and Caesar's triumph included pictures of the fallen Romans, he was careful not to celebrate their loss, and framed the victory as one over Africa instead, so as to not displease the Roman people, as they would not be happy to celebrate the loss of Rome's own sons. And indeed, the people were said to have groaned when they saw the images of Cato and Scipio, and even Caesar did not dare to include an image of dear Pompey, who was missed by the people of Rome. After the triumph, Caesar distributed money to the people. He gave 5,000 denarii to each soldier, 10,000 denarii to each centurion, 20,000 denarii to each military tribune and prefect of cavalry, plus 100 denarii to every member of the plebs. He also built the temple of Venus Genetrix, as he had vowed to do so on the eve of the Battle of Pharsalus. He had a precinct built around the temple and placed a statue of Cleopatra next to the statue of Venus for all to see. In 46 BC, after his victory at Thapsus, Caesar's status and popularity were substantial within Rome. He had been appointed dictator of Rome for a period of 10 years, and while the presiding ruler of Rome, Caesar chose to enact populist policies, regulating the redistribution of state-subsidized grain, reforming taxes, offering support for war veterans, passing laws restricting the purchase of certain luxury products, restructuring the debt laws, and so eliminating a quarter of all debts owed, and rewarding families with many children to help repopulate Rome, providing citizenship rights to those on the farthermost regions of the empire, reducing the government deficit, and expanding the number of representatives for the people within the Senate House. He also left 300,000 sesterces to each Roman citizen in his will, which is an indication of the great wealth he had accrued during his conquests, and to limit the political power of his opponents. He passed a law that limited the time in office for governors, and he also outlawed professional guilds, where many political subversives originated from. As well as this, Caesar's clemency with many of his enemies gained him a reputation as a fair and honourable leader, and news of his many victories gained him great popularity with the Roman people. During his time as dictator, he introduced a new constitution to Rome, which had 3 main goals. He wanted to bring order to the Republic by suppressing all resistance in the provinces. Second, he wanted to create a strong central government for Rome. And thirdly, he wanted to unite all the provinces as one republic. In order to do this, Caesar had to increase his political control. His first goal of suppressing the resistance to Rome had been achieved with the Gallic Wars. To secure his own political authority, he increased his own powers and decreased those of other political institutions. It was January 45 BC that Caesar implemented his most important reform, when he commissioned the Julian calendar. The Roman calendar at the time was governed by the movement of the moon. Caesar replaced it with the Egyptian calendar, which was based on the sun, and was astonishingly accurate, and he set the year length to 365.25 days, and adjusted for the quarter day by adding a leap year every 4 years, which had an extra day in February. It began on the 1st of January 45 BC, and would remain in use until it was replaced by the Gregorian calendar during the early modern era in 1582. But up until then, it had been the most accurate calendar produced by the ancient world. Caesar also announced his heir to the Julian dynasty in 45 BC, as his sister Julia's grandson, Gaius Octavius, commonly known as Octavian, later becoming Augustus Caesar, who Caesar adopted as his own son, leaving him vast estates and wealth in his will, and Caesar also declared that if Octavian were to die before Caesar, then Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, who was loved by Caesar as a son, would be the next to succeed. Caesar was well received by many in Rome, especially those from the outer provinces, who he placed into central government to elevate his influence. He received a number of accolades during this time, including an imperator for his success as a general, and he was also made responsible for presiding over the Senate as consul. And in February 44 BC, 1 month before his assassination, he was appointed dictator of Rome for life, or dictator perpetuo. And as such, Caesar became the de facto ruler of the Republic, which means ruler in reality, rather than as prescribed by law. And also, at this time, he was declared Pater Patriae, or Father of the Fatherland, and the month of Quintilis was renamed as July in his honour. The announcement of Caesar's status as Dictator Perpetuo was a great concern for his opposition, the Optimates, as they feared he would overthrow the Republic and establish a monarchy. And a month after he was declared dictator, a gesture by Mark Antony saw him place a golden crown upon Caesar's head, crowning him like a king. During the annual Lupercalia festival, this was not received well by Caesar, and he knocked the crown away from his head, claiming that Jupiter should receive the crown, as only he was king of the Romans. However, some historians think this may have been staged by the two men. Further honours Caesar received may have angered those plotting against him, or at least they were used as justifications by his enemies. Caesar was given a golden chair in the Senate. He was allowed to wear triumphal dress at his whim. His statue was placed next to those of the kings, and coins were issued bearing his image. As well as this, he was offered a popular cult with Mark Antony as his high priest. Many Senate members were affronted by the honours Caesar received, which they felt likened him to a king, and they were worried that Caesar would claim the title King of Rome, and so put the future of the Republic in jeopardy. They also felt Rome would be adversely affected by his populist policies, and wished to see the state return to conservative ideologies and ancient Roman traditions. Many of the over 60 conspirators against Caesar were supporters of Pompey, but there were 4 main co-conspirators who led the assassination. They were Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, a Roman general and politician, Gaius Trebonius, who was praetor and consul, who served under Caesar's command in Spain, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, who was the man considered to have proposed the idea of killing Caesar, and had previously served with both Crassus and Pompey. Also identified was Marcus Junius Brutus, who had fought side by side with Pompey. The execution of Caesar was carefully planned. The Senate meeting location chosen for the Ides of March, or 15th of March 44 BC, was the Theatre of Pompey, where Caesar was due to appear. Weapons had been concealed and brought into the meeting undetected, and so they waited. Mark Antony had been waylaid on his way to the theatre, as the conspirators had arranged, by Trebonius, or according to Plutarch, it may have been Brutus Albinus, and the night before, Mark Antony had learned from Publius Servilius Casca Longus of the proposed assassination, and so the conspirators feared he would come to Caesar's aid, and thus prevent the assassination. It is unclear whether Caesar was aware of the assassination attempt, but on the morning of his murder, an unwell Caesar was asked by his wife Calpurnia not to go to the Senate, but Caesar was encouraged by Brutus Albinus not to let the senators down, and so he arrived at the meeting late, with a large body of followers. Plutarch writes that on his arrival at the theatre, Caesar was met by Tilius Cimber, who presented him with a petition requesting the recall of his exiled brother. However, uninterested, Caesar waved him away, despite the other conspirators crowding around to supposedly offer support. Cimber then grabbed Caesar by the shoulders and pulled down his tunic, to which Caesar retorted, "Iste quidem vis est," meaning, "Why, this is violence." The other conspirators then began stabbing Caesar, and during the assassination, Caesar received 23 stab wounds and lacerations to the body and face. His first wound, a stab wound to the neck or shoulder, was inflicted by Casca, and Caesar turned and caught Casca by the arm saying, "Casca, you villain!" Then a slash to the face was delivered by Cassius and the brother of Casca. Titanius delivered a blow to the ribs, whereas Brutus Albinus struck Caesar with a significant wound to the leg, and he was subsequently stabbed in the groin as he lay dying on the ground by Marcus Brutus. The whole group, including Marcus Brutus, began stabbing at once in a frenzy, so much so that they injured each other. Caesar tried to escape, but, blinded by blood, he fell defenseless on the steps of the portico. The remaining conspirators inflicted a number of stab wounds to his lifeless body following the initial attack, with the wound to the ribs being considered the fatal blow by modern experts. As Caesar's dying body lay under the statue of Pompey, Caesar is said to have remarked before his death, "Kai su teknon," in Greek meaning, "You too, my child," possibly to Marcus Brutus. Although the veracity of this claim is debated, but Shakespeare would later immortalize the line in his phrase, "Et tu, Brute," meaning, "And you, Brutus," in his 16th century play, Julius Caesar, a line which illustrates the anguish Caesar must have felt over the betrayal of one he had both trusted and loved. In the aftermath of the event, Caesar's body was carried home by slaves, whilst those responsible for the killing attended the Temple of Jupiter on Capitoline Hill to discuss the day's events, and many of those dissatisfied with Caesar tried to confiscate his property and retract the laws he had put in place, but this was stopped by Mark Antony, who also prevented the slain leader's body being thrown into the Tiber River. Caesar's funeral took place on the 20th of March, and he was laid to rest at his family's tomb by the Field of Mars, with his body cremated close by, at the Roman Forum, where later the Temple of Caesar would be built. Despite Caesar's success and service to Rome, he was assassinated by members of the Senate, including his named successor. After Octavian, Brutus Albinus, as well as Marcus Brutus, the son of his own mistress Servilia and her son-in-law Cassius, and news of his death was not received well by the middle and lower class Romans, with many becoming hostile, as Caesar had been good to them, and they were outraged that a small group of aristocrats had killed their leader, and so, at his funeral, the angry mob threw branches and clothing on Caesar's funeral pyre, causing an uncontrolled fire which damaged the forum. Although the Optimates had killed Caesar in an effort to preserve the Roman Republic, in reality, their actions precipitated its downfall, as Mark Antony, seeking to capitalize on his former comrade's death, manipulated the Roman mob which rounded on the Optimates, attacking the homes of Marcus Brutus and Cassius, and according to Suetonius, those responsible for his death died by the very daggers that had slain Caesar, either committing suicide after the fact or dying in battle in the ensuing civil war and consequent end of the Roman Republic that followed his death. Ultimately, it would be Julius Caesar's named heir Octavian who would seize his adopted father's mantle and end the Roman Republic, as after he and Mark Antony defeated Cassius and Marcus Brutus at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia in 42 BC. A power struggle then erupted between Octavian and Mark Antony and his lover Cleopatra, from which Octavian also emerged victorious at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, paving the way for the suicide of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, ultimately resulting in Octavian proclaiming himself Rome's first Emperor Augustus in 27 BC. In Caesar's time, senior politicians made their name by conquest. He was not born to rule, nor was he expected to become the sole ruler of Rome, or play a major role in the fall of the Roman Republic, but his militaristic skill and political intelligence made him excel in his chosen path, and secured his destiny as arguably the greatest ever leader of Rome. Indeed, many consider Julius Caesar to be not only one of the most resourceful, intelligent and cunning politicians in human history, but he is also considered to be one of the greatest military leaders that has ever lived, as the strategic and tactical brilliance he displayed has been studied and written about by countless kings, generals, politicians and writers over the last 2 millennia. His rise to become ruler is unquestionably impressive, and his decisions were shaped by the politics of the era, as well as his own personality traits. His populist style and military strategies have been emulated through time, more recently by military leaders such as Napoleon, using his influence to carve out their own places in history. As well as this, Caesar's life has been the focus of some of the most famous writers in the world, including Shakespeare, and these works, as well as Caesar's own Latin writings, have brought the name of Julius Caesar to a worldwide audience. What do you think of Julius Caesar? Was he a power-hungry schemer with a god complex? Or was he an ardent social reformer for the poorest citizens of Rome and the greatest political and military mind the world has ever seen? Let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Many thanks once again to our sponsor, Rise of Kingdoms, for making this video possible. Begin your campaign by choosing either a wise and virtuous leader or a tyrant. Issue troop commands, build up alliances with the brilliant RTS gameplay, allowing flexible battle strategies, joining or leaving as you wish to aid allies, making the kingdom your own and recording your place in history. Then, when you have honed your skills, join the Osiris League and compete against other Rise of Kingdom players for in-game rewards or for your own glory. Download the game now for free by clicking the link in the video description and begin your epic odyssey.